Okay, let's go ahead and open up vessels. Now this says blood vessels and assessments. We're going to do assessments tomorrow. I'm sure many of you have probably had this opportunity already. We'll be looking at EKGs, and we'll be looking at taking blood pressure and respiration rates, and taking the pulse. And if we get someone that's willing to run up and down the stairs a couple times, we'll see how the blood pressure and heart rate changes uh, with that. So we're going to take a look at our blood vessels in here. And you have lots of models of the heart in front of you, and I have three different sets of blood vessel models on partial size humans. Plus, we have the torso models, which give you a pretty good representation there. So we know that our blood supply is the circulatory system is a closed system. It starts at the heart, it ends at the heart. We have arteries, we have veins, and we have capillaries. Arteries always take blood away from the heart, whether it contains fully oxygenated blood or only partially oxygenated blood. Either way, they're leaving the heart. The veins always return to the heart. They're bringing blood back to the heart. Usually the blood is lower in oxygen, somewhere in the neighborhood of about 80% saturated, except in pulmonary veins. The pulmonary veins are going to be usually close to 100% saturated because they're bringing blood back to the heart from the lungs. And the capillaries are where the action takes place. The capillaries are one cell layer thick, and we have nutrient exchange and gas exchange and waste exchange between all the cells of our bodies except cartilage and the blood vessels and the capillaries. The capillaries are in contact with every cell in our body except the cartilage cells. The alveoli have up to 100 capillaries around each alveoli. So there's a great deal of gas exchange going on there. Here's what the vessels look like. Here's the artery. You can see the very thick muscular layer right here. We have a similar muscular layer on the vein, not as thick. The outer layer, the connective tissue adventitia layer, or the tunica externa, tunica means coat. They have the same type of layers, but they're much bigger in the artery. And the inner layer is the tunica intima, which is the non-stick surface. Both the artery and the vein have that. And if you look at the top there, you can see that the capillary is just really one cell layer thick all the way around. It's an epithelial cell forming the layer of the capillary itself. And this is ideal because the capillary is designed for nutrient exchange and gas exchange and waste exchange. And so diffusion, which is how everything works through simple diffusion, very easily goes across that one membrane layer. Now, arteries and veins support each other. Arteries break down into smaller vessels known as arterioles, which lead them to capillary beds. And there are many more capillaries than there are any other kind of blood vessel in our bodies. The capillaries then are supplying everything to the cells because the capillaries are going to be in contact with the cells. You notice how the capillary bed is red on this side for highly oxygenated blood and blue over here for that has given up some of its oxygen to the cells. And then the capillary bed is drained by a venule. So we have an arteriole on one end and a venule on the other end. And we move our blood from the arteriole through the capillary bed out the other side into the venule. Make sure I've got yes. Okay, so the tunica intima is the inner lining, of the vessel that is the non-stick coating, if you will. The tunica media is the smooth muscle layer. The tunica media is where we see vasoconstriction and vasodilation taking place primarily in the arterioles, because that's where the sympathetic nervous system releases its norepinephrine and stimulates the smooth muscle in to contract or to relax. You know, relaxation, vasodilation of a blood vessel occurs simply because we're not releasing as much norepinephrine into the into the smooth muscle layer. And of course, the outer layer is, which we really don't have on capillaries. The outer layer, the tunica externa, tunica adventitia, is connective tissue holding the vessel in place. Okay, arteries come in three categories. We're going to see all three of these on our models here. We have the conducting arteries. This is like the aorta, the largest blood vessel in the body. It's going to under very high pressure. It's very elastic. It will expand as a surge of blood comes through it, and then it will relax until another surge comes out of the heart every 7/10 of a second. Further downstream are the distributing arteries that lead to the various organs, like the renal artery, or the splenic artery going to the spleen, or the hepatic artery going to the liver. These are all, distributing blood to the various organs through these arteries. And then we get down to the arterioles. These are the smallest of the arteries. There are likely more arterioles than there are any other artery type. They have smooth muscle, but around them, just like any other artery. But the arterioles are the vessels that are affected by the release of norepinephrine. Vasoconstriction and vasodilation is taking place here at the arterial level. Okay, so now the arterioles look like this. The arterioles feed into the capillary beds. They are stimulated by sympathetic nerves. The sympathetic nervous system, the other half, the autonomic nervous system, is going to control the diameter of the arteriole by releasing norepinephrine. The rate of release of norepinephrine determines the size of the arteriole by constricting or relaxing the smooth muscle. So if we release a lot of norepinephrine, we can see here, these little lines represent releases of norepinephrine. And so we are constricting the diameter of the vessel. So we are vasoconstriction, and the diameter is getting smaller. Here, we've reduced the amount of the frequency of stimulus of norepinephrine, and so the muscle relaxes. We don't release another hormone to cause it to relax. We just stop sending out so much norepinephrine. And so we get vasodilation. We control the movement of the blood throughout our body to the organs that we need it by vasoconstriction or vasodilation, because we just don't have enough blood to fill up every vessel all the time. We're always moving blood around. We are just we're a couple liters shy of what we need to fill up everything. So we don't. We move it around. We move it from the digestive system to the urinary system. We move it from the urinary system to the skeletal muscular system. We move it to the brain. We move it back to the heart. We move it around constantly. We move it to the skin. It's fairly cool in here, so we were probably restricting the flow to our skin so that we don't lose a lot of body heat. If we turned off the AC and it started getting warm, we'd start sending a lot of heat, a lot of blood to our capillaries in our skin to try and radiate that heat and try to stay cool. So we're always adjusting the movement of our blood. It's not a static process. It's constantly in motion. So here we see again, same vessel, vasoconstriction on the left, vasodilation on the right. This is where most of our vasoconstriction and dilation are taking place in the arterioles. under the control of norepinephrine from the sympathetic side of the autonomic nervous system. Same vessel, vasodilated, vasoconstricted over here. Same vessel. We've dilated it because by reducing the amount of norepinephrine going to it, you can see we maintain a constant tone in here. And so we keep the vessel at a constant size. We can constrict it, like we see on the far right over there, or we can dilate it here by decreasing the number of releases of norepinephrine to have that type of size. Yet it's the same vessel. Now the capillaries, are the smallest vessels. They are 1 cell thick. They're designed to let one red cell at a time come through. Now, red cells are very squishy. Think of a red water balloon that are flexible. They're squishy. You can, they have a lot of give to them, and red cells have that give. They can squeeze themselves through the capillary and come out. They come in from the arterial, they squeeze themselves through the capillary, and they come out the other side in a venule. And since they're only 1 cell layer thick, we can give up gases. We can retain gases. Waste products like CO2 is a waste. So we acquire CO2 in the capillary. We give off oxygen. We allow glucose to leave the plasma and go into the cells. We pick up metabolic waste because we're going through here. We're 1 cell layer thick up against the capillary. So we have this great exchange process going on here. Now, the types of capillaries that we find in our bodies are variable. We have what are known as continuous capillaries. These are the most common. We have more continuous capillaries than any other kind. They have a tight junction. But they have gaps in there because every vessel is going to be leaky. Capillaries are going to leak out plasma, which becomes interstitial fluid and so on. The continuous capillaries are found in most locations in the body. In the brain, they are a little bit different. In the brain, these capillaries are wrapped by astrocytes. They're held together with tight junctions and wrapped by astrocytes. Remember, the astrocytes are glial cells. The astrocytes are the most common type of glial cells, and they wrap themselves around the capillaries and create what's called the blood-brain barrier. And they prevent certain chemicals from getting through, and they allow the passage of some chemicals we don't want to go through, and they block the passage of chemicals that we do want to go through. But they're there to protect the brain by protecting the capillaries that provide the brain. So those are the continuous capillaries there on the left. Now, the fenestrated capillaries show up in 2 places. They show up in the glomerulus, and they show up in the small intestine. Now, the fenestrated capillaries look like a sieve. You know them as the glomerulus in the nephron. Their function is filtration. Blood comes in, the plasma goes through the glomerulus, and plasma moves through those openings, the fenestrations in the capillary, and then goes on into the proximal tubule, and we already beat that into the ground. And that's part of what the fenestrated capillaries do. Now, in the small intestine, fenestrated capillaries underneath the basement membrane of the simple columnar cells, nutrients, water, and food pass through the simple columnar cells and are absorbed by the fenestrated capillaries lining the small intestine. So here, instead of filtration, we are absorbing. So these are the 2 key places where you would find a fenestrated capillary, either in the glomerulus or in the small intestine. And then 3rd category, and you can see the fenestrated capillaries, so there's little openings there because they're pretty leaky. The 3rd category are the sinusoidals. They are going to be found where you want to have the movement of large cells. They have great openings, large openings here. Um, they will allow blood and blood cells uh, and glucose molecules and whatever and food molecules to pass through. We find them in the liver, we find them in the spleen. Remember the spleen is where red cells, sort of end up when their 120 days is up. They go to the spleen and are broken apart. We find them in the bone marrow, where we're making new red cells and white cells. So we have these large capillaries with these large openings here to facilitate the movement of blood cells into or out of a structure. So limited, like I said, primarily the liver, the spleen, and the bone marrow. And so continuous capillaries there, fenestrated capillaries, and the sinusoidals there. Now, our capillary beds are going to be moving blood to the actual cells. The arteriole, the pressure is too high for good nutrient exchange to a cell. A cell adjacent to an arteriole, the pressure would be too great for nutrients might leave, but waste products would not be able to be received because of the pressure inside here. So we have to lower the pressure by extending the overall surface area for exchange. And so we can, the arteriole turns into the capillaries, these smaller and smaller vessels, the pressure drops. And so now we have a pressure that the cells can deal with and give the cells time to offload their waste and recover the nutrients and oxygen that they want. But something about the capillary beds we don't see anywhere else are these little sphincters. These are called precapillary sphincters. A sphincter is a ring of muscle. We've talked about sphincters like the esophageal sphincter, for example, or the sphincters around the rectum, around the anus, or around the urethra. These sphincters control the movement of blood into the capillary bed. And so we can determine how much blood is going to enter a capillary bed at a given time, depending on the conditions of the body. So, for example, we can cut the blood flow off temporarily. We can close the sphincters so the blood flows through the capillary bed pretty much straightforward through here and not into the adjacent tissues. We would do this if we're trying to restrict the flow of blood to an area, like to the skin on a cold day. We don't want to send a lot of blood to the skin because blood is warm. Blood's running at 98.6, 37 degrees Celsius. We send it to the skin in a cold day, we're just going to be radiating heat. So we try to keep that temperature down near our core by restricting the flow. Now, the cells aren't suffering. We're just not spreading it out where we can lose all that heat. However, on a hot day, we would do something more like this, where we want to release this heat, release the heat from our core to the outside. And so we would allow more blood to flow near the surface, through the dermis area of our skin, so that we would actually transfer that heat from the blood here to the water in the sweat glands, so that can be released and evaporate and cool us down. So we would do that, like 98, 95 degrees yesterday afternoon. Our sweat glands, if you were outside, were probably pretty active, taking that heat away. But in here, some of you probably are experiencing something like that because the whole building's cold. I'll just let it go at that. So now, what about the veins? You have venules and you have veins. Venules connect to the capillary beds. They are low pressure vessels. They only have a few layers of smooth muscle. Blood comes into the capillary bed within the arterial, and it goes through the capillary bed. It's collected on the other side of the venule, and then the venules form veins. And the veins are very, very low pressure structures. 0 to 10 millimeters of mercury pressure is all you're going to get in a vein. The pumping action of the heart pretty much runs out, getting the blood out through into the capillary beds. The return flow is something different entirely. We have a great deal of blood in our large veins. We tend to keep a lot of blood stored in the large veins in our body. And it's easier than trying to return it all back to the heart too. But we bring sufficient amount of blood back to the heart all the time, but we have a lot of the blood is held in reserve in these large vessels. That's why they call them like blood reservoirs, if you will. Now, we still have to get blood back to the heart. We still have to put enough blood in the ventricles so that we can have an adequate stroke volume every time. So we have a series of mechanisms to make this work. We use what's known as the skeletal muscle pump. And in addition to that, we have what's known as the respiratory pump. And we have valves inside our veins. They're called venous valves. Now, pumping takes place when we squeeze a vein filled with blood with skeletal muscle on either side of it. As our skeletal muscles contract, we are compressing the veins and we're pushing the blood in the veins back towards the heart. Now, fortunately, all of our veins are surrounded by skeletal muscle. And so our blood flow coming in from the extremities is moving into the venules and into the veins and moving into the larger veins. And as we compress the vein with skeletal muscle contraction, we're actually squeezing the blood up back to the heart. Well, we can't keep contracting all the time. So built into our veins are a series of valves. So as we squeeze a vein, we shoot blood up through the vein, and then we stop contracting our skeletal muscle, and the blood drops back down. Except we have valves in here. It's similar to a semilunar valve. It's a passive valve. It is a cup-shaped valve, and as soon as the pressure drops from the skeletal muscle and blood starts dropping back down, it hits this valve and it closes the valve, and the blood is stuck in that section until the muscle contracts again and squeezes the blood even further. And so in this case, the valve is closed. We squeeze this section of the vessel. Blood goes up through the open valve, and now it has moved up. We're sort of milking the blood or pushing the blood up the vein. Has nothing to do with heart action. It's all about pushing this blood up here. The valves simply prevent backflow. We push the blood up, it drops back down, it hits the valve, it stops, so we can squeeze it again and push it up even further, and we push it up even further. And every time we push it up, it drops back and hits a valve, and we're a little further along each time. So we use our skeletal muscle to push our blood along. We use the movement of the diaphragm and the ribs to squeeze the larger vessels to push blood up, like in the inferior vena cava, the large vessel here that we see right here, right next to the abdominal aorta, the blue one. You know, as we raise our diaphragm, as we raise our ribs and drop our diaphragm, we're creating pressure in the abdomen. That pressure is pushing on the inferior vena cava and pushes our blood back towards the heart. And the valves look like this. As we squeeze, we put the blood up into each segment. We go through each valve, and every time, when the pressure drops, the blood drops back against the valve clasp and stops. And then we squeeze it some more, and we have more blood going up. Now, when they stop, when the pressure stops, the valves automatically go shut. So, and this is how we get our blood back from the extremities in our arms and our legs and our feet, because there's no push from the blood from the heart anymore, because once we've gone through the capillaries, the pressure in the blood has dropped practically to zero, between 0 and 10. And this is how the valves work. They push up, gravity pulls the blood back, they hit the flaps go shut, and we retain blood there until the next contraction. And here we see what the flaps look like right here. Blood is going this way, it drops back, and it closes, and then we squeeze some more, and you can see the walls narrowing a little bit here as we're squeezing it, and blood's going up to here, and it keeps dropping back, and it happens fairly rapidly. Now, this was all discovered. This process of a valve was discovered by William Harvey more than several hundred years ago. He experimented on himself. He couldn't get his kids to hold still long enough. And I only say that half as a joke. Most scientists up until the 20th century would experiment on themselves and on their children to see if things worked. Pasteur, who invented the vaccine for anthrax and the rabies vaccine, tested it on his kids. So they all survived. So yeah, well, that's why they till the next experiment. That's why they all had lots of kids. They were test subjects. Anyway, what Harvey did, Harvey's also the scientist who discovered oxygen. He put a tourniquet around his arm. Well, when you go get blood work done or you go give blood, they put a little constricting band around your arm, and it causes the veins to pop up. So he put a tourniquet around his arm, and then he pressed the vein with his finger, and he pushed the blood out of the vein. He pushed it up towards the heart. Now, he thought that if he pushed the blood up, the blood would just flow back in. But when he pushed the blood up past the tourniquet, nothing came up. Nothing came in there because the valve had been emptied. The section where the valve was empty. So when he discovered this, he realized that there was a structure in the arm that would keep the blood from sliding back down. So, and then he got himself a few cadavers and dissected the arms, and he could see the valves. You stole them. So you dug them up, yeah. 200 years ago, I probably would have been a grave robber, but to teach anatomy. So, okay, because that's what they did. So
we had to learn somehow, I guess.
yeah, well, yeah, and two of the most famous grave robbers, I'm really digressing, were Burke and Hare, if you ever heard of that. They used to pick up bodies in Scotland. Where they got out of control was if they couldn't find a body, they made a body.
Oh, so that's right.
They killed people. Yeah. So anyway. Okay. Now, problems with our veins. These valves don't always work well. Varicose veins is an example. A varicose vein is a valve that has failed, and blood, instead of going up into a section and staying there, drops back down against an incompetent valve, a valve that won't hold. And so now you get this swelling in the legs. This is a pretty extreme case here. But varicose veins are simply valves that have failed, and blood is accumulating, below the failed valve. And so you get this bulging on the surface of the skin. It's all gravity. Gravity is never our friend. In the case of here, an individual who spends a lot of time on their feet, occupations that require, 8-10 hours a day on your feet are prone to that kind of condition. The other condition here is hemorrhoids, which is sort of varicose veins around the rectum. An individual who spends a lot of time seated runs a risk of developing these hemorrhoids. What will happen is that you will compress the veins around the rectum, and they will become distended and swell up, and blood flow slows way down, and you end up with this inflamed area. It looks like this. This is what a hemorrhoid looks like when the valves fail because of the constant pressure. And often that's, it can be treated topically. In extreme cases, it can be removed surgically. But it is, people that have hemorrhoids, have a great deal of discomfort when they sit, just like someone with varicose veins has a great deal of discomfort when they stand because the blood's not getting back. So I always wait till after lunch to show this picture too. So now we're going to look at the vessels in the body. So we have several models here around, but we look at the first thing you're seeing is the area right around the cervical, the cervical region here in the neck. You're going to see some of the largest vessels in here. The blues are veins and the reds are arteries, even though they don't really look like that for real. But the first thing you would see is, come on, there we go. There's an arrow down there. Now, first vein coming off to the left is known as the left brachiocephalic vein. And I'll give you a hint here. If you have a left of anything like left brachiocephalic, you have to have a right brachiocephalic. If you have a left subclavian, you got to have a right subclavian. Just, we don't leave you hanging with left brachiocephalic and nothing on the other side. So the left brachiocephalic is formed by two smaller veins. One of those is the left subclavian, which runs directly underneath your clavicle. So the left subclavian vein is running this way, going towards the heart. The left brachiocephalic vein is right here. It's formed from the left subclavian and this vein right up there. And that vein is one you've probably all heard of. That is the jugular vein. So the left jugular vein coming down from the brain joins the left subclavian to give you the left brachiocephalic. And you're going to see the same thing in the right side. You're going to have a right jugular vein, you're going to have a right subclavian vein, and you're going to have a right brachiocephalic vein. The brachiocephalics are very short veins. They're not very long at all. Over here is the right subclavian, and that blue structure there, you'll see a little bit of it, is the jugular vein. Now, most veins and arteries are going to share a common name. There are only a few exceptions. We don't, the vena cavas, this inferior vena cava, this large vein here in blue runs right beside the abdominal aorta. They don't share a common name. The jugular vein and the carotid artery don't share a common name. Just about everything else does. The radial artery has a radial vein running down here, running along your radial bone. The renal artery has a renal vein right here. The hepatic artery has a hepatic vein. So in most of the body, if whatever the artery name is the same name as the vein, because they're usually running side by side. So here we see the left jugular and the left subclavian forming the left brachiocephalic. Here we see the left common carotid artery. Now the left common carotid artery is coming up off of, the middle artery right here. This is the aorta, the aortic arch. You've all got one in front of you. The aortic arch comes up and curves down. And this middle artery right here is the left common carotid. Now, the reason we call it common is because on the left-hand side, that left common carotid is going to run up here to the carotid sinus, right here directly below your earlobe, below your mandible where you can take the carotid pulse, and it's going to split. And it's going to go internal, and a branch is going to go external. It's going to supply the brain. So when you have the term common, it usually means it's going to split. And so we have the left and right common carotids coming up here, splitting and going internal and external to supply the brain. So there's the left common carotid artery. There's the right brachiocephalic. And there is the right subclavian. There is the right common carotid down here. So can't tell much from this diagram where it's coming from. And you certainly can't look at the heart here and see where the right common carotid is, because the right common carotid isn't one of these three that come across the top. You have the left common carotid, the left subclavian, and you have the brachiocephalic artery. Just to show you a little bit of a curve there. Okay, so here in the neck, we've got the right and left carotid arteries. We have the right and left jugular veins. We have the right and left subclavian veins directly underneath the clavicle. We're going to have the right and left subclavian arteries running right beside them. And we have the right and left brachiocephalic veins. The right and left brachiocephalic veins will form the superior vena cava. Superior vena cava is this vessel right here. It's going to be draining into the right atria. So here we see this is the superior vena cava here. It's only superior because it's above, not because it's big. If we were looking at size, the inferior vena cava is much more massive. The inferior vena cava drains the upper third of the body. It goes right into the right atria here. So the left and right brachiocephalic vein will come together to give you the superior vena cava. So let's take a look here. Close up on the circulation around the heart and the lungs. So the first thing we see, of course, there's the heart. There's the pulmonary trunk. The pulmonary trunk is, if you remember from last week, the pulmonary trunk is this big blue vessel right here. It's an artery. Even though it's blue, it's coming from the right ventricle going out to the lungs and through the pulmonary trunk. The pulmonary trunk branches into the pulmonary arteries. It's blue because it's only about 80% oxygenated. You know, it's got the blood coming back from the body. So that's the pulmonary trunk. Directly above the pulmonary trunk, you have the left and right pulmonary arteries, both in blue, because the blood's going out to the lung, hasn't gotten oxygenated yet, or reoxygenated. So there is the ascending aorta, the large red vessel coming up out of the heart. It comes up and it dives over and forms the aortic arch. There's the aortic arch right there. You all have one in front of you in your model. This is the aortic arch that here. Notice how real life never looks like the models. Remember last week and cutting up the hearts? Nothing looked like that. So, okay, aortic arch. Now there is the brachiocephalic artery. It has a distinction of being the shortest artery or smallest artery in the body. This first artery coming off the aortic arch right here is the brachiocephalic artery. It's about 1 inch long. Because if this is the left carotid artery and this is the left subclavian, well, we have a left carotid artery and a left subclavian. We need a right carotid artery and a right subclavian. What we do is we take the brachiocephalic artery up about 1 inch, and then it splits. And the brachiocephalic artery will split and give you a right common carotid and the right subclavian. There's the left common carotid. There is the right common carotid artery. So this is the brachiocephalic right there. Coming up from that, going straight up is the right common carotid. Branching off of that, over here, coming around is the right subclavian. Remember, the subclavian artery and vein run side by side, just like many other arteries and veins. So there's the left subclavian artery. It's the last of these three arteries here, coming across the top, right before the aortic arch dives down to go through the diaphragm. Right here is the subclavian. So it'd be sitting here in your chest like that, and this is the subclavian coming off, running out underneath your clavicle, with the left common carotid in the middle, and the brachiocephalic here, just before it, it gets about an inch or so, and then it splits into the right common carotid and to the right subclavian going this way. So otherwise, we'd have to have 5 arteries coming off the aortic arch, and it's easier just to have 3, with the first one splitting into 2. And there is the left subclavian artery. Notice how we have if you have a right, you have to have a left. Right subclavian, left subclavian. Right common carotid, left common carotid. Right jugular, left jugular. Now these are the vertebral arteries here on both sides, so your left and right vertebral arteries. The main reason we put them in here is because they're often used as a donor artery for bypass surgery, where you only have to, you can disconnect the artery from one side and bring it down and plug it into the heart below the blockage in the heart. It is much less intrusive than having to go into take the saphenous vein out and tie that into the aorta and below the blockage. So you're doing less cutting and less tying and less time to have the patient's chest open too. It's still going to be bypass, but it's not as ultimately as invasive. Okay. And there's the right vertebral arteries on the other side. Now below the subclavian artery, we have the axillary artery right here in the axilla, in this part of the armpit. Now the axillary artery is matched by, you want to guess? If an artery and a vein have the same name, the axillary. Thank you. Yes. The axillary vein you're going to have an axillary artery and an axillary vein right here. The same on both sides. So that you go from the subclavian to the axillary. And the axillary is going to go then to the brachial, which is the one that's right here. This is the one that you block to take blood pressure. This is the one that usually has a constricting band put around if you're having blood work done. So they tighten it off right here. And so we go from subclavian artery to axillary artery at the armpit to brachial artery here. And then we run down the arm with the radial and the ulnar. Again, if you know where your thumb is, you can find your radius. Your thumb's right here. Your thumb lines up with the bone, the radial, the radius. The ulna is right underneath it. If the radius is here, you have the radial artery on top going down the arm, the radial vein going back. Below, you have the ulnar artery going out and the ulnar vein coming back. And both of those combine to form the brachial artery here, which then gives rise to the axillary, which gives rise to the subclavian, all because you know where your thumb is. If you can find your thumb, you've got your radial pulse right behind the thumb, because you're measuring the pulse in the radial artery here, and that tells you that there's a radial artery here and an ulnar artery underneath it, and a radial vein underneath the radial artery, and an ulnar vein underneath the ulnar artery. And then the arteries came off of the brachial artery here, which came off the axillary, which came off of the subclavian. All because you know where your thumb is. So now, so there's your brachial artery, and the brachial artery will split off, give you the radial and the ulnar down here. Same on both sides. Left and right sides are identical. There's the radial artery, and there is the ulnar artery right next to it. We use the radial artery because it's convenient to take our pulse right here at the, we get the radial pulse right behind the thumb. Okay. And if you're, interested, that's the diaphragm right there. So right below your xiphoid process. And there is the abdominal aorta. So again, we're not sharing the same names everywhere. We have the abdominal aorta running down through the diaphragm. The aortic arch curves over, and we have the thoracic aorta going through the diaphragm. As soon as it goes through the diaphragm, it becomes the abdominal aorta, and it continues on down just about to the belly button region here, and then it splits. Running right beside it is the inferior vena cava. It's a large vessel. It's much larger than the superior vena cava. Unfortunately, for the inferior vena cava, it's below the heart. So it's inferior, I don't know if it has any issues with that, but it is. It's the inferior vena cava simply because of its position. So, but the aorta, it passes through the diaphragm here. There's the abdominal aorta, and the inferior vena cava passes through the diaphragm also, going back up, and it will dump into the bottom of the right atria. And here we see in our heart model, right down here, that is the opening for the inferior vena cava. Superior on top, inferior on the bottom. And you'll notice that the inferior one has a much larger opening. It has to, because it's draining 2/3 of the body. Okay, moving on. There's your hand. Now we have an interesting little circulation pattern here in the hand. It's pretty straightforward. We have the radial artery. There's your thumb. The radial artery is right there. The ulnar artery is here. We are matched by the radial vein going back up to the heart. Here's the ulnar vein here. We have two distinctive patterns of crossover here in the hand. There's our radial artery. There's the radial vein right beside it. And that bone there is the radius. There's the ulnar artery and the ulnar vein right beside us, and that's the end of the ulna there. Now, as we move closer to the hand, we have a loop here called the superficial palmar venous arch. Palmar arch is fine. The venous palmar arch, whatever. It makes this loop. We have a corresponding name for the artery below it. That is the superficial palmar arch artery. So the red ones are always the arteries, the blue ones are always the vein. You notice how now the blood draining the fingers all comes back to this arch, this venous arch here, and is collected. Blood going to the fingers leaves this arch and goes out into the phalanges. And we have the digital arteries and the digital veins. The digital arteries are coming off of the palmar arch, supplying blood to the tissues of the fingers, of the phalanges, and the digital veins are returning that blood to the venous arch and taking it back to the ulnar vein and the radial vein back up to the heart. And so we see this, it's not very complicated. We're sharing, you know, we're sharing all the names, you know, ulnar artery, ulnar vein, radial artery, radial vein, palmar arch for veins, palmar arch for arteries, and the digital arteries and digital veins. When we get to the arm, we don't have oh, yes, we do. Here we go. If we look at our arm, but you all thought you'd never see these things again. So we can see the axillary artery and the brachial artery in here. We can see the axillary artery is the one in the armpit. We would see the axillary artery right there. Directly below the axillary artery is the brachial artery right here. That's the one in this part of your arm. Then we have the radial and the ulnar arteries down below. I want to pass this around so you can see where everything is. So there's your axillary artery. There's the brachial artery. And then this is tomorrow when we play with the blood pressure cuffs, you'll be able to occlude that artery. If you haven't done it before, it's fun. If you have done it, then it'll be, you know, old hat for you. But there's our brachial artery right here. And then just below the brachial artery is where it splits into the ulnar and radial arteries. And there's our radial artery on top and the ulnar artery down below. And we move further down into we get a closer look at the hand. And again, there's the radial artery just behind this, you know, we can track it from the thumb. And we have the ulnar artery down below. We can track the ulnar artery from lined up with the little finger. So ulnar artery here, radial artery here, and the radial vein and the ulnar vein run right beside. And of course, there's the palmar arch right there with the digital arteries. So, okay. We're looking now, we'll take a closer look at the heart again. Here is our aortic arch. Now this I like this one because this has made the brachiocephalic artery visible underneath the brachiocephalic veins. And what we're seeing here is just what happens with the brachiocephalic artery. It's about an inch long, and then it splits and gives you the right common carotid and the right subclavian almost instantly. So it has the distinction of being the shortest artery, the shortest major artery in the body. Okay. Left common carotid, right common carotid. You see how the right common carotid is coming off the brachiocephalic, and the right subclavian is coming off of the brachiocephalic also. So you can see here is that is your right subclavian, because there's your brachiocephalic right there. Left subclavian, right subclavian. So they match. The subclavian arteries are matched by the subclavian veins. The only difference here on the right-hand side is that the right common carotid and the right subclavian come up off the brachiocephalic. Everything else is the same on both sides. Take a close look at the heart again. There's the right atria. I'm sorry, left atria, left ventricle, tricuspid, mitral valve, chordae tendineae, papillary muscles on both sides, the interventricular septum between the left ventricle on the left and the right ventricle on the right. And there is the right atria, the right ventricle, the tricuspid valve this time. And of course, you can see its chordae tendineae also. There's the pulmonary trunk, draining, blood leaving the right ventricle goes to the lungs through the pulmonary semilunar valve into the pulmonary trunk. There's the pulmonary trunk there. And those two large blue vessels here and here are the right and left. That's the left. This is the right pulmonary arteries. They're blue, as I said, because they're lower in oxygen. They haven't been recharged yet. Okay. Left pulmonary artery and the right pulmonary artery, which means that the red vessels directly underneath them are going to be the right and left pulmonary veins. They're bright red because they are contain blood that is fully oxygenated on its way back to the left atria. Ascending aorta again. The arch. Brachiocephalic artery. Left common carotid and left subclavian artery matched on the right side by the right common carotid and the right subclavian artery coming off the brachiocephalic. Superior vena cava, and that little section you see there is the inferior vena cava just before it goes through the diaphragm. Right pulmonary artery, right pulmonary vein, and matched on the other side. Now here we see the superior vena cava, the left brachiocephalic vein, and the right brachiocephalic vein. The brachiocephalic veins don't have the problem like the brachiocephalic artery does. There's only one brachiocephalic artery, but there's two brachiocephalic veins. But they're going to give rise to the superior vena cava. The left and right brachiocephalic, so you the superior vena cava here, right there. There's only one brachiocephalic artery. This is, one of the exceptions to the rule that everything is matched. There's your left subclavian vein. There's your right subclavian vein. There's your left internal jugular. There's your right internal jugular. There's your axillary vein running right next to your axillary artery. So the axillary vein is right here, running right next to the axillary artery. And directly below the axillary vein, you're going to have the brachial vein. So the brachial artery and the brachial vein are matched. The axillary artery and the axillary vein are matched. The subclavian artery and subclavian vein are matched. Same on both sides. Now, a couple of differences, though. Near the surface of the arm, above the humerus, you're going to have you're going to have the cephalic vein. And below the brachial vein, you're going to have the basilic vein. And you're going to see that the basilic vein branches off into the median cubital vein. So this is where it gets a little fuzzy, if you will. Okay. Diaphragm, inferior vena cava. Now, this vein that's sort of curving up around here is the gastric vein. It's coming back from the stomach. Now, remember, the stomach doesn't have a whole lot of absorption taking place, water and glucose and some salts and alcohol and stuff, and it's going straight over here to the liver. So most of your absorption is taking place in the small intestine, and that's going to come up this vein right here. But we have this gastric vein draining off from the stomach, and we're going to have another vein here coming from the spleen. It's the splenic vein. This is our spleen, sits over here, right about here. Well, the good news about it is the splenic vein is also supplied by this red one called the splenic artery. So all you have to do is know the name of one of them, and you're going to have, if it's blue, it's a vein. If it's red, it's an artery. So there's the splenic vein. Now there is the superior mesenteric vein. That's going to be the primary drainer, I guess that's a word, of the small intestine. Because this blood in the superior mesenteric vein is coming up here to go to the liver to be cleaned up. Because everything we eat and drink gets absorbed in the small intestine and it goes straight to the liver to be detoxified because who knows what's in it? What kind of food additives, what kind of toxins, what kind of chemicals are in the things that we eat and drink. So the liver is designed to clean that up. So everything from the digestive system absorbed from the small intestine is coming up here to the superior mesenteric vein going into the liver. And the reason it can do that is because there is another one of those little exceptions here. We have what's known as the hepatic portal vein. Normally, the superior mesenteric vein should drain right into the inferior vena cava, because there's the inferior vena cava, a nice big blood vessel right there, and blood's supposed to be coming back up and going to the heart. But if it goes straight to the heart, we haven't had time to clean it up. So we bypass the inferior vena cava with the hepatic portal vein. We bypass the vena cava, go into the liver, clean everything up, and then we use the hepatic veins to dump that cleaned up blood into the inferior vena cava, so that the nutrients that are in that we have absorbed from the small intestine now are cleaned up. They've been detoxified. Otherwise, if we send it straight through the vena cava, we would get exactly what we ate. And we don't want that. You want to clean it up. That's what the liver does. So the hepatic portal vein allows us to temporarily bypass the vena cava, send it all to the liver, clean it up, detoxify it, make it look pretty, and then run it into the inferior vena cava to go to the heart and then get pumped out to the body. And there is the hepatic veins going back, or there are the hepatic veins going back to the vena cava that we bypassed initially. And there's the renal vein leaving the kidneys going back to the vena cava. And right next to it in red is the renal artery. So let's clean it up a little bit here and take a closer look at the flow through the lower half of the body. There is the hepatic artery going to the liver. We'll see that a lot of these smaller arteries are all named for the various organs they're supplying, like the hepatic artery, the renal artery, the splenic artery, the gastric artery. There is the superior mesenteric artery sending blood out to the small intestine. We're going to see all of those here. There is the celiac trunk supplying blood to the stomach. We have the gastric artery right there. We have the splenic artery there going to the spleen. We have, that's the superior mesenteric artery. You don't get to see much of that, but that is sending blood to the small intestine so that what we're absorbing through those fenestrated capillaries is being, that's the blood coming into the capillaries that are going to grab the nutrients that we're absorbing. They haven't been cleaned yet. They'll get cleaned in the liver on the way back up. But right now we have blood going out to the small intestine through the superior mesenteric artery. And of course, if you have a superior, you have to have an inferior mesenteric artery also. There's the renal artery. And there we have the gonadal arteries that are supplying blood to the ovaries or testes. We have the splenic vein right there. You would have a renal artery, a renal vein, a splenic artery, a splenic vein, a gastric artery, a gastric vein, a superior and an inferior mesenteric artery and vein. So, okay, here we see the abdominal aorta, the inferior vena cava. We have the celiac trunk there. We have the superior mesenteric artery. We have the left gonadal vein. If you have an artery, you got to have a vein. There is the right gonadal vein. The right gonadal artery. And the inferior mesenteric artery shows up a lot better on the whole model as opposed to this. Okay. The abdominal aorta, the inferior vena cava, the right renal artery, the right renal vein. This is known as the right common iliac. The abdominal aorta comes down here. This is right about the level of the inguinal region, right about here, maybe just below your belly button. And it splits into a right and left common iliac. So the right and left common iliacs are going to go down your legs. Now, it's common. That means it's going to split again and go internal and external. We're going to see this artery have an external component and an internal component on the right and left side, matched by the veins. So whenever you have the term common, it means it will split and go internal and external, like the right common carotid and the left common carotid are going to split and go up internal and external around the brain. Same thing applies here. The right common iliac will be matched by a left common iliac, and you're going to have a right common iliac vein. That's the blue thing underneath it. And on the left-hand side, you'll have a left common iliac artery and a left common iliac vein. And there's your right common iliac vein right alongside of the iliac artery. So taking a closer look here at our abdominal region, we can see the left and right common iliac veins in blue with the left and right common iliac arteries in red running right beside them. Now they're going to split and give you an internal and an external iliac veins, right and left side. You can see that inferior vena cava. Okay, here we go. So what we see here, these little ones branching towards the midline are the internal, right and left internal iliac veins. And here the right and left external iliac veins are going outward. Remember, when you have the term common, they're going to branch off and give you an internal and an external. That's what we have here. The same thing applies to the artery. You're going to have a right and left common iliac artery branching off to the red vessels are going to be the right and left internal iliac arteries and the right and left external iliac arteries. Here we see them. Right and left common iliacs, inferior vena cava. There are the external iliac arteries. And the red one, the small ones inside there are the internal iliac arteries. Same name as the veins, the iliacs. Okay. We get a little further down now, we can see just where those iliac arteries and veins are going. You can see here's the external iliac artery on the right and left side. Here's the right and left external iliac vein. You can see the right and left iliac arteries, the internal ones up there. Once we get down below the groin region, the iliac artery is going to split. There's the abdominal aorta. There's the inferior vena cava. We have the right and left deep femoral arteries, which are found just below the hip. You can see where the hip is going into the acetabulum there. we're going to have the circumflex vein and the circumflex artery, which wrap themselves around the neck of the hip, there at the neck of the femur. Because there's the femoral circumflex vein and the femoral circumflex artery. They're wrapped around the neck of the femur. There is the femoral artery, the large artery in the leg, where you can get the femoral pulse in this region here. You have one here and one over here, and you have a femoral vein right beside it. There's the femoral vein. We also have a much smaller vein called the deep femoral vein. And this large vessel here, this is the great saphenous vein, runs along the medial side of your leg, all the way down your leg, and it becomes the candidate for bypass surgery. Early bypass surgery would take the great saphenous vein. The great saphenous vein on this model is this vein that runs all the way down here like this. And the great saphenous vein would be cut out. It would be cut and tied off. And it would be taken out, cleaned up, and it would be taken to a heart, and it would be tied into the aorta right here and brought down below a blockage in one of the coronary arteries. So you would have to cut and tie off the vein, which is not a big deal because our blood supply is pretty redundant, so the return flow wouldn't be affected too much by the loss of the saphenous vein. And then you would have to cut into the aorta, and then you would have to surgically attach the vein here, and then go down to your blockage and go below your blockage and tie it in there. You cut into the blocked artery below the blockage and surgically attach it there. Problem with veins is that they don't have the ability to fight off plaque accumulation like an artery does. And so the great saphenous vein, while it worked for a while, it was discovered that particularly if your patient didn't change their lifestyle, what they were eating and their activity levels, that plaque would accumulate inside the great saphenous vein, and they'd have heart issues all over again. I mean, if you look up how often people that have a transplanted heart have heart disease, because they won't they get a new heart and they stay really healthy for a while, and then they slide back to their old habits. It's human nature. We can't help it. That's what we do. And so now you'll have a patient who's had a heart transplant, and 10 years later, their heart they're having heart disease again, experiencing heart disease. So anyway, I'm not gonna be critical of anybody with that issue, but that's what happens. So, okay. So here is the great saphenous vein. We used to use it a lot. It may still be used somewhat, but it's easier to use the mammillary artery or the vertebral artery, because there you only have to make one cut of the artery. You don't have to tie into the aorta because you're already indirectly tied in, and just bring it down and tie it in below the blockage, and it works. So, okay. In the leg, we have the femoral artery and the femoral vein running side by side. Right there's the femoral artery and the femoral vein. You can see it here on our leg model, conveniently highlighted in yellow and red. And if we go further down, we can pull off the gastrocnemius back here. We'll be able to see the deep veins down in here. We could pass this. Okay, there's our knee. Now, there's the great saphenous vein coming down on the medial side of our leg, right along by the knee. It's going on down here. And there's the deep femoral artery on the other side on the lateral side. The femoral artery is running right beside the great saphenous vein, again, on the medial side of the leg. Now, when you get below the knees, you'll see there's a big hole where the knee is. We don't have a hole like that, because our gastrocnemius doesn't have to stick in. Anyway, we have an anterior tibial artery. You know, remember the tibialis anterior is the muscle that sits right next to the anterior crest. Remember your anterior crest on your, let's go back to, you know, skeletal system in AP1. The anterior crest is that sharp ridge on the front of your tibia. It's what we walk into things at night with. That's how we identify tables and chairs that weren't there in the daylight. So we use the anterior crest to find them. Well, the tibialis anterior muscle runs right along that edge. Well, it's supplied by the anterior tibial artery. And if we have an anterior tibial artery, we got to have a posterior. So, okay, here is our tibialis anterior right there. And there's a great big red artery running right down the middle of it. And that is the anterior tibial artery. There's the anterior crest right there. So the artery is right in here. And if you have an anterior, you're going to have a posterior. And if we flip the leg over, you're going to see the anterior and the posterior. Okay, so here we are looking at the back side of the knee. There we have, above the knee, we have the popliteal artery. Below the knee, we have, you can see also the popliteal vein runs down across the vein, often the site of a deep vein thrombosis, a blockage in the vessel, a thrombus forming there, or maybe slightly below that. There we have the posterior tibial vein, another candidate for a thrombosis occurring in here, because these areas are going to get compressed if our legs are bent long periods of time. So we have a posterior tibial vein. We have a posterior tibial artery, which is right there in red. Because if you have an anterior tibial, you got to have a posterior tibial. And it's those veins that give us trouble. That's is the site of the deep vein thrombosis. And here, if we look at the front of the foot, we can see the anterior tibial artery right there, the anterior tibial vein right there next to it. And we have the dorsal pedis veins. You'll notice they form their own similar network like we saw in the hand. They come down, that they're coming up here and collecting blood flowing up from the feet. And here we see a similar arch for the blood supply going out to the feet, to the toes. You see that is the dorsal pedis artery. Instead of an arch, we call it the dorsal pedis, the artery and the veins. And there's the arcuate artery there. And the dorsal venous arch. Okay, and we have, instead of the digital arteries, we call them the metatarsal arteries and the metatarsal veins. Okay, and that is the end of blood vessels. So I hope that wasn't too tedious. So, and we're going to put an end to that.